Hello and welcome to the Waters Technology webinar. Today's discussion will be about how the industry is faring in a post-Mifid II world. As we all know, the revised Markets and Financial Information Directive went live on January 3rd, 2018. This is after months and months of preparation and anticipation, and I don't know that anyone involved expected things to go perfectly smooth, although it seems like the bumps in the road were relatively small, and there are some things that are still being traversed. And one of the areas that's being discussed and that's being worked on and that's being improved is the area of some systematic internalizer data. And it was identified relatively early in the process as a challenge that would need to be overcome. And a number of solutions have been proposed, and we're going to talk about what the key challenges are and what some of those solutions are during the course of this webinar today. We've assembled a really wonderful and diverse team of panelists to thoroughly discuss the information with all of our listeners. I should introduce myself first. I'm Jamie Hyman. I'm the editor of InfoPro Reference Data. And I will go ahead and toss to each of our panelists so they can introduce themselves, tell them your name, and just a little bit about themselves and how they relate to the topic at hand that we're discussing today. So first, I would like to hand it over to Peter.
Thanks, Jamie. So my name is Peter Moss. I'm the CEO of the Reference Data Utility, which is an industry initiative to manage instrument reference data more effectively in the financial markets.
And then up next we have Liz.
Thanks, Jamie. Liz Carter. I'm the Managing Director and Business Lead of the Tradeweb APA service. We launched our service on the 3rd of January very successfully, I'm pleased to say, and have so far reported over 6 million trade reports in the first quarter of 2018.
All right. Next we have David.
Hi, I'm David Bullen. I run my own strategic advisory consultancy. I've got clients in fixed income primary markets and fintech space. I also run a trade association for the major non-equity MTFs in Europe, and I've also, more appropriate to this call, been heavily involved in coordinating the SI Registry Data Group as a project coordinator.
And rounding out our panel today, we have Andrew.
Hi, I'm Andy Munro. I'm from the buy side. I'm the Global Head of Fixed Income Trading at Janus Henderson. I've been here for over 20 years. Prior to my current role, I was Global Head of all asset class trading at Henderson pre our recent merger.
All right, and thank you, everyone, for joining us for the webinar and for this discussion today. I think that now that we are just under 5 months away from MiFID II implementation, it might be sensible to start broadly and then narrow things in a little bit about the more specific challenges. So I'm hoping that we can have just a brief update, a brief overview of where we are right now. Just under 5 months out from the MiFID II deadline. And Peter, would you like to take this one?
Yeah, so let me kick off at least. So I think like everybody in the market, we were rushing to get things completed for the end of the year. If you talk to a lot of people in banks, I think MiFID pretty much meant that Christmas and New Year holidays were cancelled, and everybody was sort of striving hard to get to the start line of the 3rd of January. Remarkably, I think, actually, given the late arrival of a lot of things went remarkably smoothly. And given that we were collecting back in January, I think it was just under 5 million securities from probably a couple of hundred different organizations. The reference data came together pretty well. There are still some issues. There are still sort of glitches in sort of individual attributes, but nothing that you wouldn't expect when you're collecting data from 200 or 300 organizations up through the regulators into ESMA and then back out to the market as a whole. We've seen, I think, generally guidance from ESMA sort of becoming clearer as the months have gone on. We've had sort of RTS 1 and 2 data starting to flow. We've had the double volume cap data sort of starting to get out there now as well. And so I think things are starting to fall into place. And what we see in the market is that there are now sort of people starting to focus on making sure that they've got a robust solution in place, making sure that they're actually able to have a control framework sitting alongside the day-to-day operations. And so we're getting on to the sort of the more nice to have things. But there are still one or two gaps, and I guess that's one of the areas one of those gaps is one of the areas that we want to sort of focus our time and attention on today. Let me stop there. Liz, anything from your perspective?
Yeah, I'd say pretty much the same as you, Peter. I think in the run-up to the launch, it was certainly an interesting time with quite a few areas of uncertainty still existing. I think there was, certainly areas of the regulations and the text that was open to interpretation, somewhat unclear, particularly on a practical and actual implementation level, that had to be sort of worked around. I think the fact that there were several new service providers that firms, including ourselves and investment firms, had to navigate, each with a critical dependency on the workflows. So I mean, firms such as ANA DSB, the new ESMA FERJ file, all critical to workflows. And no one really knew how they were going to behave or how you would interact with them until sort of that go-live day, really. And I think the other obvious gap, Peter alluded to, was the SI status of investment firms, which we're going to cover in some more detail. But despite these challenges, I think it's a real testament to the market and the industry that transparency reporting did successfully begin on the 3rd of January. And I certainly take on board that it does need to evolve to perhaps a more streamlined, a more automated, a more bells and whistles type process. But the fact was that it did happen, and I think we all worked really hard to achieve that. And I certainly look forward to improving upon the good start that we've all made.
And getting into the systematic internalizer subject that you guys have mentioned several times, the first time I remember hearing that there was an issue and that solutions were being proposed was at the European Financial Information Summit. So I want to say that was in November. So that was relatively late in the game. But I have a feeling that the idea of managing and maximizing and organizing this data and making it usable and making it sensible is something that's been talked about for considerably longer than that. And I believe David would like to give just a kind of an overview of the history of this idea.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. The history doesn't date back too much earlier than that because effectively it was late summer, if anybody remembers the history, early autumn, where it became clear that there wouldn't be an SI registry available in any other form. There was a little bit of time lost when market participants were looking what I call left and right to see who was going to actually step into the gap and to the breach. However, I remember starting with the SI registry group and staying very clearly. We had 9 weeks effectively from forming the group to actually delivering a result for January the 3rd. There was an awful lot of work done in a very short period of time, thanks to all the APAs involved. Technical work, whitelisting IP addresses, putting a template together, putting an ops procedure together that worked for everybody, that worked within the times allowed. There was legal work involved. There was agreements between APAs for the submission of data. There was license agreements. There was an awful lot of concurrent work done to make sure January the 3rd was hit. Luckily, the history was really reinforced, and the cooperation between APAs was because the principles everybody was striving to achieve, a complete and accurate set of data, an efficient process for everybody, minimizing cost for the industry, making sure we hit the January the 3rd date and were ready in time for the market, was all agreed very unanimously by all the APA participants, and that's what fully aligned the group. It's also key to point out that the group is very open to other participants on equivalent terms, so whether that be other APAs or other SIs. And really, in terms of the history, though, we were doing all of this as APAs. separate APAs and companies. We realized we needed a third-party service provider. We were also concurrently undertaking a search for that third-party provider, and that turned out to be SmartStream RDU, and we're delighted to have them sitting effectively in the middle of this process. They only got involved, I think, really in late January, formally, and then took ownership of the processing around Easter time this year. And that facilitation of a more robust central point facilitated by a best-in-class provider like RDU has been the history up until today. And that's kind of where we've got to. And I'm going to hand it over to Peter to say, where are we today?
Do you or Liz want to actually just touch on why it's important? Why this data is necessary?
Absolutely. I'll give a stab, and I'm sure Liz can jump in, but it's effectively to provide input to rules engines to drive accurate and complete reporting. But Liz, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say that it was a huge worry for an APA to be kind of have this gap of who is an SI at what asset class, at what sub-asset class, at what subclass. Not having that plugged in a workflow was a huge worry. And I think that's why, to David's point, all of the APAs that we're working with, of which there's 6 now, quickly understood that we couldn't solve this alone, and we had to work together, and we had to work quickly together because we all face the same challenge and the same issue. And yes, just in a bit more detail, when a trade report is submitted into the APA, firms who submit those trade reports, that they pretty much quite often rely on the APA to actually confirm and determine whether that report is eligible to be reported. Now, one of the validations is reporting party, and I think we're all familiar with the ESMA reporting party hierarchy and waterfall. And one of the essential components is, are you trading with an SI? And if that piece of data is not accurate or unknown, missing, then suddenly the APAs could be over-reporting, could be under-reporting, and it kind of really demolishes any kind of accurate transparency that you're hoping to achieve. So absolutely, as part of that workflow, you need to be able to understand not only is your submitting party, i.e. your member of the APA, an SI or not in that particular asset class, subclass, etc., but also whether their counterparty to the trade is. So even as an APA working on your own, you may well know your members' SI statuses. That would kind of be assumed, but you don't necessarily know the counterparties. And that was the real challenge and the issue that we were trying to solve. And fortunately, through the collaboration and the SI registry, we were able to do that.
And then I was actually hoping that on the same topic of why this is important, that maybe Andrew could give a bit of the trader perspective.
Yeah, sure. So from the Janus Henderson perspective, we looked at the trade reporting obligations across all asset classes, and we took a view, and it's not necessarily one that the whole buy side has stuck to. It's varied depending upon basically people's resources, wallets, and appetite for integration or risk. But we took the view that we actually thought there was going to be a relatively small amount of trades that we did where we would be required or be responsible for doing the reporting, because we felt in equities 90% or plus would be either traded with an SI or on a venue. And in fixed income, we actually thought that we took an early hope that the vast majority of our meaningful counterparties would become SIs. We were pleased to see that was a correct assumption as days wore on. It got very hairy for some period of time when people were vacillating about coming out and publicly stating that, some as late as the second week of January, which was mildly frustrating. But from our point of view, we wanted to know if our broker was an SI or not, because it meant we knew how we needed to engage with them, because we decided we were not particularly keen on building an extremely expensive to-the-second trade reporting system for what we felt was a disproportionately small amount of our flow. We didn't think the cost and expense required was a proportionate response to what we had to do for our responsibilities. We felt we could either rely on the brokers being SIs, or that we could, if we knew that they were an SI or not an SI, we knew when we needed to do a process trade, which was another way of actually getting a trade report done on our behalf and getting that transparency to the market. We still have occasional glitches, and I think this is where this product will really help us. A lot of our counterparties claim to be SIs, but then if we're trading something that's perhaps non-European or slightly more esoteric, but we're not an SI in that name, and we didn't necessarily know that until we've done the trade, at which point we would have either done a process trade, or if we thought we could get an equal price with someone that is an SI, we might have gone to them as well. So for us to be able to know on a security level who's an SI before we actually trade, I think that would be very valuable to my guys, just in informing how they engage the market. It won't necessarily change who they trade with, but it may change how they engage with the street.
All right,
Thanks,
and then
Andy.
I think that brings us. Sorry. I think that brings us to Peter, to talk a little bit more about the actual registry itself and how it stands right now.
Yeah, exactly. So let me just talk a little bit about what it is we're actually doing and how we're collecting the data and how that data is sort of made available as well. So as Liz said, absolutely critical data to have, essentially so that you can determine who is providing systematic internalizer services for which instruments in the market. And the only reliable source for that data, realistically, is the SI themselves. And so the approach that was put in place and has now been adopted by a fairly broad swathe of the market was to define a standard template allowing organizations, systematic internalizers, to declare the instrument sets that they are providing systematic internalizer services in, and collect that template from the big brokers, the SIs, on a daily basis. Now, the daily cutoff is 5 p.m. European time, actually I think UK time, and so SIs that are wanting to change their declaration will send the updated template to an APA of their choosing. So typically all of the SIs are contracted to at least one APA, so they may have a choice of one or two that they can actually sort of send it to. The APAs collect the templates from their SI customers and consolidate those into a set and pass those on to the RDU. And then the RDU actually consolidates the full set and provides a consolidated set of data out to the market. At the moment, we're providing it to all of the APAs, who in turn are providing it back to their systematic internalizer customers. And so you get a flow of data coming from the SIs through the APAs, being consolidated at the reference data utility, and then flowing back out to the market through the APAs to the SI contributors. What we announced a couple of weeks ago was that we're actually now also making that data available more broadly in the market. And so it is now data that is available from us as a reference data utility. And we're getting quite a bit of interest from a combination of sell-side firms who perhaps aren't systematic internalizers yet, buy-side firms, to Andy's point, who perhaps want to understand the services that their brokers are actually sort of providing in the market, and we're getting quite a lot of interest from third parties, so data vendors and trading platform providers who are interested in perhaps making this data available to their clients as well. So there's quite a lot of data flowing backwards and forwards, and I think we're now up to pretty good coverage. I mean, Liz, I know you've done some analysis on the data that we've collected. Do you want to chime in on what you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, we've roughly estimated that we're at around 80%, sort of thereabouts, of SI coverage. We've had a couple of new SIs join recently, and I think we certainly anticipate an increase in that number as we approach the September where the mandate of the SI regime comes into play. But we've always felt that it's the APAs and the lead APAs that are really going to be the easiest kind of lift to have the market coverage that's required. And I think this is proved with that, roughly 80% of the market of the SIs covered in our SI registry.
Excellent. So let me just sort of finish off then. So finally, I mean, obviously this is an industry-wide initiative, right? So it's open to all APAs to join, and we're actively sort of exploring that with further APAs. It is open to all systematic internalizers, and we've deliberately designed the process so that it encourages systematic internalizers to contribute their data. So for a systematic internalizer, contribution is free, and as a consequence of contributing, they get the consolidated data set back free of charge. There is a small charge for others that want to consume it across the market, but fundamentally consistent with sort of the general sort of premise across MiFID as a whole. We're looking to basically cover costs with a reasonable margin for the approach of actually collecting this data and making it available more broadly. So let me stop there for the moment.
Okay, we do have a question regarding the cost of the data, and I assume that we're not going to sit here and do a price list, but is there a way for people to find out more about that?
Yeah, I mean, we have a price list. As you said, I don't think it's appropriate to actually sort of share it on this call, but it's not unreasonable. The way we're actually making the data available is in two forms. So you can have access to all of the data if you choose, and there's a price for the files that contain all of the data collected from all of the systematic internalizers. But we're also providing an API to the market, which allows firms that perhaps have smaller consumption to literally make an API call with a particular ISIN and get a list of the systematic internalizers that are providing SI services for that ISIN back. So that model is very much usage focused, and therefore is pretty cheap for people who actually just want to trade a small number of instruments on a daily basis, or you can have the full enterprise-wide, all-you-can-eat sort of data set that you can use across your firm. But in all cases, I think we've set the price point at a level which is actually commensurate with sort of the value of the data, but actually also the need for it in the market. So we've been quite reasonable.
Okay, and then, because this is something that is existing and as available, I am curious about how it's been received, how it's being used, and I think David was hoping to weigh in a little bit on that, especially from the APA point of view.
Yeah, Jamie, absolutely. The feedback, I'll give you two forms. From an APA that was currently involved and is involved heavily, the comment was, I'm not sure what we'd have done without this facility. Let's be clear, goes back to the point Liz made. This was a crucial input to a regulatory requirement to report trades accurately, not to underreport, not to overreport, and one of the existing firms was certainly very keen on that. The other answer I'd come from an APA perspective is, and I'm right in the center of this, continuing dialogue with other APAs, and from the interest level we're getting, the interest in this process from APAs beyond the group of 6 who are already involved is very high. So I can understand that actually the feedback is very positive, that the industry needed this facility. It exists, and we expect this community to grow. But at the API level, I'm not unfortunately in touch with the SI community. I defer to a colleague on the panel.
All right, and I think Liz has a little bit more to add on that topic.
Yeah, I would just add that I think the data that RDU are making available to consumers, I just wanted to add that, this is not just a dump of data. This is an accurate data set that is actually used for processing among the lead APAs, which drives the critical publication of trade reports. And not only that, this data is then shared back to all the participating SIs who also consume these master files and use those. So any kind of exceptions, errors are caught very early. We're talking about a really accurate set of data here that is already used in some very critical processing. So you can kind of be assured that if you are consuming this data is accurate. And I think that's really important.
Okay. Does anybody else care to weigh in on that topic before we move on? No? Okay. We're gonna shift to a slightly different area under MiFID II just for a moment, because we've received some user questions that branch out a little bit, and specifically we received one on RTS 28 disclosures on policy in top 5 venues. They're being released by ESMA. They help guide the specifics of best execution. And this listener would like to talk about the data component of RTS 28 and why it might be causing some issues for firms. And I think Andrew possibly had something to say about this.
Yeah, we actually think the data that's being requested or required to be published isn't particularly helpful for the end consumer or our clients. If anything, we think it's misleading or, if not downright confusing. I can give you a couple of examples, and I'll stick to fixed income because that's where we're at the moment. If we look at last year's data, which was obviously 2017, a number of our trades that we did we would trade via voice, but we would just take a VCOM on TSOX. And sorry, there are other systems are available, but that would get tagged as a TSOX, just TSOX in our system. We didn't actually do the trade on TSOX, but up until MiFID came in, we didn't differentiate between that as an electronic trade as a venue or just a captured affirmation process. We do for going forwards, but for that we needed to strip that out of our data set when we reported on RTS 28 because we felt it was very misleading. We actually don't think the end consumer really want to know that whether we traded on Tradeweb, Market Access, Bond Vision, or Bloomberg TSOX, because it is an RFQ platform. Having talked to the regulators, they originally agreed with most of the buy side that our end counterparty, be it JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, UBS, etc., was probably of more interest. But it turned out that because of the way the rules are written, the RFQ platforms are a venue, and so that's what needs to get reported. Equally, on the FX side, a huge percentage of our volume will be done through a single RFQ platform, which is, having looked at a couple of my peers' published data set, seems to be remarkably similar. Now, does that mean we've done all of our trading with one person? No, it doesn't. It just means we use that system to access a huge variety of other providers, liquidity providers, but that's misleading in the RTS 28 data. Equally, for fixed income, it's just purely on notional amount, and it shows no relevance to duration of the trades that you're doing or the value of risk of the trade. So if you happen to be doing a couple of large, very short-dated trades, that can totally skew your volume data, which again we think is misleading of very little value. And then if I'm theoretically meant to look at my broker's data set to determine whether I'm getting best execution when I execute with them, it just shows me more an indication of where their flow is. Their flow may not tally with mine. They may be particularly busy in Swiss bonds where I'm not. So their top venues may be determined by the nature of the flow they receive. Does that mean I'm trading in the wrong place? Well, no, they're probably still making me very good prices for the bonds that I'm going to them in. So we just think it's a bit of a flawed data sample. And equally, if we pass a chunk of our flow off to our North American desk, that can be shown as where we've passed our orders to. And again, we don't think that is of a great deal of value to the end client, but that's what the regulator is asking us to do. So it's unfortunately what we're doing.
All right. And then we do have another question in from a listener, and there's not context. It's just a very simple little question. Do you have any intraday change capability? Is what it says. And I think David said he would weigh in on that one.
In terms of intraday change, no. The SI registry is effectively an end of day. I think Peter alluded to it. It's at 5 o'clock for 8 o'clock. Made available through the, if you like, late evening London time, European time, and then is effectively consumed by all the APAs in reverse and all the SIs in reverse during that business evening for the processing the following day. So it's a daily process as it currently stands.
All right. Well, it's been a very interesting discussion, and MiFID II, like any sort of contained regulation, any sort of specific topic, there's kind of the past, the present, and the future. So, we talked about how the data, the problem was identified, the solutions were identified, and then, how we got to where we are today. But it's not like this is a finish line. So I was hoping that we could possibly look ahead about what the future is for this data. Are the parts going to continue to move? Is this a final solution, et cetera, et cetera? And Andrew, I was hoping that you could give me the first perspective on that one.
We're hoping that the additional transparency that's coming out of MiFID will lead to, hopefully, and I think this is where the regulators are coming for as well, greater liquidity and availability to trade in the markets. We're at the infancy of fixed income TCA. I certainly don't want to run down the rabbit hole that equities have done, but we certainly think if we can frame where we think a reasonable market is, I think that will give us greater confidence in trading and equally our counterparts in being able to make a risk price if that's what's required. We think there are still some big strides to be made in the data providers providing that data in a way that is much more consumable by the end users like ourselves to make meaningful trading decisions from. But we think that will come in time. We're looking at data aggregation tools at the moment. And we think that it will make the market more efficient in the long run. there are teething problems at the moment, and it's slightly painful. But I have to be honest, MiFID as a whole was not the cataclysmic event that we all thought it might be. The sun continued to rise in the morning and set in the evening, and liquidity was kept at pretty much unchanged from the previous couple of months. So we were very pleasantly pleased or surprised with the way it went, but we do think there are benefits to be made with the transparency that's coming, and we think more electronic trading is on its way. ETFs, more auto quoting from brokers across a wider spectrum of securities than is currently being quoted, and we think that will increase liquidity into what can be a relatively illiquid asset class in certain areas.
Thank you, Andrew. David, what are your thoughts on a look ahead?
Jim, I guess I'll take it at two levels, a sort of strategic view and a tactical view. Tactically, on the SI registry, the group is very focused on making sure the product is going to be fit for the September 1 changes that the industry will face. So tactically, that is what the future of the SI registry is, and I'll let Peter elaborate on that perhaps a little bit later. Strategically, from my other engagements across the industry, I'm aware that this approach where the industry steps up and solves problems, or shall we say, makes MiFID II more streamlined, more efficient, more practically and operationally efficient. Those type of issues are ongoing in other spaces, and I'm sure the industry will step up, as they have done here, and work together to solve it for the industry, by the industry, if you like, in a practical fashion. So I think there'll be other refinements in other areas along those similar lines. The same spirit, if you like, that's put the SI registry together, I think that will manifest itself in other places as well.
Liz, I'm really interested to know what the future of systematic internalizer data looks like from an APA point of view.
Yeah, I think as we continue to have more APAs join our collaboration and the SI registry, which we fondly call SIR, SIR, I think that it will continue to go from strength to strength. More SIs, I think, even if their APAs perhaps are not part of the collaboration, are actually coming to the APAs that do participate and looking to provide their status through those APAs. So it's not necessary that the actual APA has to belong to the collaboration, even though that would be very helpful. And we certainly 100% depend on this data to carry out our daily operations as an APA provider. I think we are looking, I guess the next big thing for us is kind of focusing on the mandate, the SI regime mandation that starts in September. We certainly understand there'll be more SIs that will be, if they haven't already opted in, will have to become an SI at that point based on their thresholds, etc. And we're kind of looking further to streamline and improve the process and the data further with that data in mind. And to that extent, we're actually setting up a working group, so a kind of RDU SIR working group with the participating SIs, the APAs, and of course SmartStream RDU to kind of just make sure we've got everything covered. And I certainly think actually that it might not end there. I mean, if you look at the good data set that we have, plus the collaboration from all of the APAs, and then a very strong technical provider and partner, I think there could be other synergies that then start playing out. So I'm quite excited about this particular initiative, and I'm very pleased to be part of it.
All right, and finally, Peter, what are your thoughts?
So just picking up on a couple of the themes there. I mean, September the 1st is clearly a very important date, there's no doubt. And we see a number of new systematic internalizers coming into the market, partly because they think they might end up having to be systematic internalizers because of the mandate for perhaps a small set of instruments that they're large market makers for in their domestic markets. So we see reasonably significant number of firms actually sort of getting in line for that. There are other firms that actually are looking at becoming systematic internalizers, perhaps more from a competitive perspective. They see, I think, business perhaps being preferentially sort of pushed towards SIs because it's just easier to do business with an SI. And so other firms are looking at that as a compelling reason to sort of become systematic internalizers for certain sets of instruments again. And probably the overarching point here is that most of those new SIs are going to be SIs in relatively small amounts of data, which means that it's going to be even more important to know exactly what instruments they're covering. And I think that just sort of lends even more importance to this overall data set, to the working of the market as a whole. From a strategic perspective, I mean, from my view on this is that this is exactly the sort of thing that the regulators wanted the industry to step up and fill gaps with. This particular sort of initiative, I think, has been very well managed by the APAs. We've been very sort of pleased to be able to work with the APAs as they've already done a lot of work in this space. And I think this is, for us, a classic example of how an industry initiative can support something that the industry wants to do more broadly. And primarily our remit is to help solve these sorts of industry problems. So I think generally this is a very good initiative. Specifically when it comes to September, I think there'll be a lot more activity. And I think this hopefully is a collaboration that will continue to sort of work and grow over the coming months and years. So we're very pleased with the way it's gone.
Oh, it's always nice to hear, especially when I think that in some cases people were anticipating a lot more trouble and a lot more drama. So 5 months out being pleased, I think there's worse things. So you said there were a few themes, but the key theme really seems to be growth, more SIs, more APAs, more SI data. As this takes shape, it'll be really interesting to see how this aspect continues to evolve, and I'm sure it's something that we all will continue to keep an eye on and keep talking about. But in the meantime, that does bring us to the end of this discussion today, and I just want to say thank you to Peter, Liz, David, and Andrew for your time and expertise. And for Waters Technologies, this is Jamie Hyman, editor of Inside Reference Data, and thank you also to the listeners for tuning in. I really appreciate it.